everybody thinks safety when you say Volvo. You know, first brand, what's the safest brand? Volvo. How did that become a thing? How did that become common, mate?
It started probably with the forefounders of the company. When it started, you know, they said cars are driven by people, so the guidance of everything we do has to be safety. And that's something that's continued right through to now and still ongoing.
I think, when I think Volvo, I do think safety, but I think things like innovations within that, like 3-point seat belts and things like that. What are some of the developments and inventions that you think Volvo's synonymous for?
The seatbelt, obviously, you know, the fact that the patent was left open, so it became something everyone uses. And the development of the seatbelt as well. You know, we've gone from just having a belt now to pyrotechnic devices, electric motors, and things like that. But then you've also got, we were the first to develop the emergency braking system, which came out standard on the car. Then we added the camera into the system, which then opened up a whole world of different scenarios, pedestrian detection, cyclist detection, things like that.
I find anecdotally less and less people drive older cars, which is obvious, right, as the fleet gets newer. I drive plenty of old cars, 40, 50, 60-year-old cars. If you wind the clock back that far and you had to pinpoint one safety-related invention that's come in that period, what do you think the biggest change has been?
I think if you look at it from like a life-saving technology or something like that, it's got to go back to the seatbelt. You know, the Smithsonian in the US, they said that it's saved at least 1 million lives. And you know, no one's ever going to know the real number, but you know, it's got to be a big count, the fact that it's still ongoing now. No one's come up with a better design.
Yeah. You've noticed in the past 10 to 15 years that electronic technology specifically has improved exponentially, and it's almost hard to keep up with the rate of change. In the last decade, what do you think the biggest change has been?
I think it's come into the advanced assistance systems for drivers. You know, your AEB, your active cruise control, lane departure warnings and things like that. So trying to protect other road users as well as the drivers themselves, make the driving task a little bit sort of less stressful.
A lot of what we're talking about there is avoiding an accident, so preventing it from happening. And there's a lot of discussion, we're guilty of it at Drive as well. We reference active and passive safety without really diving into the differences. Is there a simple way to differentiate for the viewer who's got no idea what we're talking about, what the difference between active and passive safety is?
As from a passive safety point of view, you're talking about the structural integrity of the car, the crash safety that's in it, airbags, seatbelts, things like that. When you talk about active safety, you're actually talking about a system that may intervene to assist the driver or actually just warn the driver beforehand. Because the idea now is we actually want to stop the crash happening as opposed to having the driver survive the crash.
And on that subject of active safety, those systems are now integral in a modern car, in that you're almost not recommending cars to buyers unless they have that active safety in them. What's some of the technology that's happening there? Because that's more computer-based technology that then relates to a physical event, right?
Yeah, it's the ability to now have camera and radars in the cars and things like that is what's changed the system before, because now the car can actually be aware of its surroundings, what's around it, can detect the difference between a pedestrian that's about to walk across the road or one that doesn't walk across the road, because you need to, with these systems, you need to make sure they don't falsely activate, because that'll be the thing that'll turn people off and start turning them off.
Now, that's an interesting point you make, and we're probably guilty of this road testing at Drive. There's a blur, and I'll say this personally because I'll turn them off if they don't work the way I'd like them to work. There's a blurring of the line, I think, between what constitutes a safety system and then a driver assistance or a convenience system. I see something like a blind spot light that comes on in the mirror. I know it's a safety system, I get that, but I see that almost as a convenience because it just sort of happens without you knowing what it's doing and how it's working. Does Volvo see that there's a line between those, that some are more driver assistance and some are more convenience?
Yeah, you know, if you look at the auto park function, this is probably an example. You know, I've demonstrated it hundreds of times, but I probably never used it in practice. But I also know people that use it all the time because they can't reverse park a car. So, you know, that's sort of probably a difference between assistance systems, safety systems. The blind spot warning, may not be a safety system for the driver, but it may be a safety system for the motorbike rider that's coming up behind you quickly that you can't quite see in the mirror. So, there's protecting the drivers and then also protecting those outside the car, the vulnerable road users especially.
I think, again, we find when we're reviewing cars and we're listing safety features or describing them, there's a lot of letters and acronyms, right? You'd be buried in it more than most. I think most people watching would know what ABS is. I think most people would know what AEB is. So ABS, anti-lock braking system, AEB, autonomous emergency braking. What are the other key systems along those lines that are under the surface of a new Volvo that a viewer might not be aware of?
Even we talk about ABS. ABS now is a much more complicated system than what it has before. It has ready alert braking, so the instant you come off the accelerator, it pre-charges the brakes so that the car's anticipating that you may be braking. You then go into the different sort of functions of that. You also have your different lane departure warnings, lane keeping assistance, and these are all expansions of a technology. Before we had the warning would come on as you were drifting out of the lane, the lighted flash. Now it actually gives you some feedback in the steering wheel, and if a car's coming up in the blind spot, the light will now flash fast to say that there's something there, and you'll actually get some resistance in the steering wheel to sort of show you need to be having a better look at this, and that's like the progression of each of these technologies.
We touched on this a little bit before, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. For me, the sign of a really good safety system, and this is coming from the background of someone who, like you, drives effectively professionally for work, the sign of a good system is one that you don't know is there. It's just working away, and you kind of say you don't need your anti-lock brakes until you need your anti-lock brakes, and they just work for you. Is that the way that you see it from a Volvo perspective, that the best systems are the ones that do what they need to do, but they're not intrusive?
Yeah, and the point from our point is that the driver is always in control. That's the sort of number one fundamental. There's nothing that will take control away from the driver, but there are some situations where you think maybe the driver's not concentrating enough. That's when you'll hear the system or feel the systems come in. One of the classics is probably the emergency brake assist, where you've hit the brakes very fast and quite unannounced, but you haven't pressed as hard as you can. So the car thinks, well, hang on, you're trying to stop this thing. I'll apply more braking into the car, and the car will pull up at the maximum amount of brake pressure it can, and the driver doesn't really feel the difference. And that's probably something where you get the system and actually come in and go, okay, you need a bit of help in this, because it could be the seating position's not right and you can't put the brake all the way down.
We've learnt some amazing stuff speaking to the safety team at Volvo headquarters in Sweden. A lot of things I didn't realise about the level to which the brand and the manufacturing team and the design and engineering team look into serious accidents, the research they do, the data they collect, all of that stuff. You mentioned this before, but is it fair to say that the industry, and Volvo from your part, has now genuinely adopted a prevention is better than the end, trying to fix the end result situation? So before, make the occupants as safe as possible, so when you crash into the tree, the occupants are safe. Now these technologies are about avoiding you from crashing into a tree in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we've looked at with the accident investigation team. So they've been established since 1970. They were investigating all crashes involving Volvos around Gothenburg. And that was where the designs for the new R&D came in. We saw the injuries that were happening, and then you start actually looking at, okay, what technologies can we develop, put in place that will actually then prevent those injuries, and sort of becomes what we call the circle of life,
What's the next evolution? I think there's a little bit of a fear, maybe people who are more old school in their mentality, in that you learnt that you got in the car and you were the driver of the vehicle and you were in control of everything and everything was down to you. There's a fear in that mindset that the driver's removed from the equation. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, certainly with the fleet of vehicles we have. But what do you think the next evolution in vehicle safety is, but beyond what we're talking about here?
It's probably to what you could almost class as a supported drive, moving towards autonomy. So the next technology you'll start to see is more LiDAR in cars, so a light range detection system as opposed to radar, and that gives us a much more detailed picture. You end up with thousands of points of light which are reflecting back and gives you a map of what it is. That will allow more chance in autonomy, and from our point of view, we're looking at the driver is either involved in the task of driving or the car is driving, the car's in control. So, and that's the two sort of defining moments there. Either I'm driving the car or I've decided that, okay, I want it to be autonomous here from this point.
On that one, is it Volvo's position that an autonomous car is inherently safer than one that's being driven by a human? Does Volvo have a position on that?
I think, yes, from the point of view of, we've said that, if the car's running autonomous mode and has an accident, we'll be responsible for it. And that seems to be the way the industry's heading as well. The real issue, people have sort of asked this previously, and the answer is an autonomous car safer than a car? No. It's probably the same. You've got the same ability to brake and steer and things like that. But where the difference is the autonomous car doesn't get distracted. The car is 100% focused on the function of driving the car. It's aware of its surroundings the whole time and things like that, because we all know from sitting in the traffic, people aren't. And that is really where the difference comes into play, is that if I'm in an autonomous car, I can actually remove myself from the task of driving, sit there, read a book, the car will continue on its way to where I can sort of need to pull off the road next.
I suspect as we move into a ideally safer and safer future, connected technology is going to play more and more of a part. Like, to me, the thought that you have an accident, the vehicle rolls over, the vehicle detects that you are unconscious, you're unable to either get out of the vehicle or call emergency services, but the vehicle can do that for you because it's connected. That seems like incredibly sensible technology to adopt. And we talk, about car to A, B or C communication. Can you explain a little bit about the theory of connected technology, and do you think that's going to play a big part as we move forward?
Yeah, the best example we had was there was a project started in Europe a while ago where they called it slippery road and hazard warning. And the idea was then if a Volvo has its hazard lights on or had lockup because of frozen road, was that signal would be sent back into the Volvo cloud and then would come up as a broadcast in the dash of your car. So you actually knew there was a hazard ahead, especially around a corner or something like that. So the idea then to expand that into all the other cars on the network and to the infrastructure is where you start talking, and that's sort of something that will become important for traffic management, incident response and things like that.
So that's sort of car to cloud back to cars.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk at the moment, even within our industry, journalists are concerned that artificial intelligence is going to be, you'll be here talking to a robot, it'll be asking you the questions. Is it going to be a catch-all to everything? I suppose it will assist manufacturers in terms of what you're able to learn, because you'd be able to employ AI within the vehicles to learn things about driving behaviours, but I assume it still can't account for everything either.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into the testing and development of this sort of stuff. It's also the driver's responses as opposed to whether they are in control or not in control. So you end up with a situation of trying to make sure, and this is the other thing. People, when you're not involved in driving, if it takes you 15 minutes longer to get somewhere, you may not care because that 15 minutes is something I'm doing somewhere else. I'm catching up an email or watching something on TV. So you do end up with the fact of, what happens if, the car has to be able to cope with these scenarios. That may mean the car travels slower, but the car needs to be in a situation where it's aware of what's going on around it.
I've said broadly that if you're around about 50 years of age, I think you're unlikely, and I may look like an idiot, I'm willing to put myself out there and say that, I think you're unlikely to see driverless cars mixing it up in general traffic in Australia broadly in our lifetime while we're on the road, so in the next 30 to 40 years. I accept that we'll see them in controlled environments and in certain situations. Is that a position that Volvo agrees with, or do I have to put my hand up and say, no, I'm a bit of an idiot here?
From Volvo agreements, I'm not really sure, but from personally, I think that's where we'll be. We will end up with shuttles that are running autonomously, but they will be geofenced. From a manufacturer's point of view, we need to provide a car that you can basically get in here in the office and drive anywhere in the country. That is a long way off with a fully autonomous car on every road, especially in Australia where we've got so many thousands of kilometres of dirt road as well.
And roads that are unmarked as well,
Yeah.
you know, once you get outside large areas, that presents a problem, doesn't it?
It can do, depending on, the cars are getting smarter from that point of view. They are looking now at edges more than line markings. So sometimes you can actually, if there's a defined edge, the car will start to function and work through that. But other times where it's just like a graded road and there's not really an end to it, yeah, the car doesn't see it.
Is there an innovation that, and it's interesting asking anyone who works at Volvo this question, because Volvo's often been at the forefront of this kind of thing, but is there an innovation that hasn't arrived that you'd like to see arrive, or are you impatiently sitting there saying, I really want that to be available?
I think the one that some people are waiting on was probably the autonomous driving, fully autonomous, where the driver's out of the loop. Personally, from my point of view, that's one thing I'd be looking at, you know, to be able to sit in the freeway and commute home, picks up an hour and a half a day sort of thing for me, which I think is, you know, there's benefits in that. But that's something that people have to work out if they're willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, the more technology goes into the car, the cost changes as well.
Is that something we have to accept? Just staying with that for 1 second, the more technologically advanced and the smarter the cars get and the more that is in them, they are going to get more expensive, aren't they? I mean, that's kind of the reality of the technology, isn't it?
It's like buying a computer.
Yeah.
You can buy a cheap computer for this, or you can go and spend a fortune, depending on what you want. So, you know, you look at the cars when they start moving to having the LiDAR and things like that, the computing power that's needed to actually calculate through that is much more than what it is with the radar systems. So again, you know, you're becoming more and more reliant on having processing power and things like that. That has power consumption issues. So yeah, you know, you sort of couldn't end up with a car that does everything for you and still expect it to be a, you know, 9990 drive away.
Especially when you speak to older drivers, even though broadly speaking, the act of driving a car hasn't changed that dramatically in the last, let's say 30 years, get in car, start engine, put in gear, drive off, indicators, steering wheel, brakes, etc. You speak to older drivers, the refrain is often, younger people have forgotten how to drive, they don't know how to drive, they didn't learn properly, the cars have got too much technology. There's two ways of looking at it, isn't there? Yes, we've forgotten how to drive the way we used to. Is that a bad thing? And then if you're driving new cars, does it matter that you can't reverse park without a camera and sensors, because everything that you're driving's got a camera and sensors in it anyway?
Yeah, unless you get into a car that doesn't have it, then you're in trouble.
Then you're in trouble,
So
yeah,
that's sort of the catch. And maybe it'll come up to the point where it's similar to licensing for automatics and manuals.
Yeah.
You know, you'll have a licensing system that is, if you're in a fully automated vehicle, you're allowed to drive those, but you can't jump into a 66 Mustang because you don't know what you're doing. And that's sort of the way it's going. But I think, you know, a lot of the systems can be turned off. And so from a driving point of view, I've always said, you know, if I'm stuck in traffic bumper to bumper at 5 kilometres an hour crawling, that's not driving. That's just from getting from A to B.
Correct.
You know, if I want to go up and have a run through the hills somewhere, you turn the systems off and you drive the car. So and I've always differentiated the two that way. There's driving and then there's just the act of transport.
I guess you've answered the question about too whether there's still room if you're a driving enthusiast and you love driving. You do exactly what you said there. You find your favourite piece of road, you turn off the autonomy and you drive it yourself, right?
Which is what happens now, realistically. You know, you find that some of the roads you want to drive through, you want to drive the car. You just don't engage the active cruise control systems.
I suspect I know what your answer is going to be, but to this one, but can a car ever be perfect in terms of safety, or will there always be something that you're working on to make it better?
I think you'd always try to improve. Because the other thing is there'll happen, there'll be different requirements, different things that people want and different needs. So, you know, there'll be things that will come into play with that as well. You know, future mobility for people, you know, when they start getting into, and this isn't from a Volvo point of view, but when you start talking about mobility assistance for people, you know, that's something that's going to be looked at in the future so that, you know, people with a disability can actually get transport from A to B. If they can't drive, this will give them transportation and things like that. So that's where the autonomy thing, I think, is the exciting part for people, where it gives people that don't have the ability to drive now the ability to get in a car and go somewhere.
I think Volvo head office, from a head office level, clarified a statement that it made in 2008 about nobody dying in a new Volvo from 2020 onward. I think initially the media took that as that's what we want to happen, but Volvo clarified that to be more of an aim, which I think is a fantastic aim to have for any manufacturer. How's that tracking from a technological viewpoint? And it might be an obvious question, but is that something Volvo is still aiming for?
If you remember, it was, we called it Vision 2020 because it was a vision. But we also said working towards the fact that cars don't crash. So, and that's probably where the change has been now. If you look at from that 2008 to 2020 period, we came out with autonomous braking, pedestrian detection, cyclist detection, large animal detection, automatic braking systems. The technology curve that came in those few years has been phenomenal in the cars. But now where the change is actually now looking to actually protect vulnerable road users outside the car and other road users. So we're moving from a point of actually stopping you being injured in the car crash to now getting you not involved in the crash.
On that point, we talk about this specifically with electric vehicles. With more structural strength, and obviously with an electric vehicle, comes more weight. It's almost unavoidable. Not so much in the structural side, but certainly when you're talking about electric vehicles. You touched on vulnerable road users there, whether it's a pedestrian, a cyclist, mum with a pram, dad walking the kids or the dog or whatever. Does a manufacturer have a responsibility, and it's difficult because you've got to protect the occupants of the vehicle that you have sold to them to drive, but does a manufacturer have a responsibility to also protect those other road users around it?
Well, we believe we do. If you look at some of the tech that's been in the cars, we had on the large SUVs, we had a secondary subframe member that did nothing for the crash of the car. But what it did was, because you've seen the difference where you have a large SUV and a small car, they don't have the bumper-to-bumper compatibility. So having this second cross member below the main cross member of the car activated the safety systems in the other vehicle. It didn't do anything for us. But what it did was it actually would make sure that you had no bumper overrun, and maybe it got the airbags to come on in the other car sooner and things like that.
Does electrification present opportunity for technology in terms of safety? The fact that the car is becoming as smart and almost like a highly functioning computer or processor, does it present more opportunity than you had with internal combustion engines?
Probably, mainly from a packaging point of view.
Sure.
You can work out where you can put the weights, and you don't have to have the engine sitting in the front of the car anymore. Yeah. It can be wherever. But other than that, if you look at the XC40 now, where we have either it as internal combustion engine or an electric vehicle, the technologies are still the same. We're still running the same Google Assistant systems through the car and things like that. So there may be some, but it's not really all of a sudden now we're electric, we can do this.
One of my favourite things when you go to, for example, the headquarters of Volvo, is talking to the design team and the engineering team and watching the debate that they have, the internal debate, right? Because the designers say, yeah, you come up with all this great technology and we've got to try and package it and make it look nice. And the engineers are saying, you take all our great technology and water it down to fit your packaging. There's a real internal power struggle there, which I think is healthy. What factors, when we talk about safe electric vehicles, do you think have to be factored in now that weren't before? I mean, the obvious one's the battery pack, right, which is a big mass that tends to be put down in the bottom between the wheelbase. But what factors do you get advantage of with packaging?
You're probably looking at putting your weight where you want it to, so centre of gravity and things like that of the car. It improves the handling of the car because your mass is down low on the floor now. That's really it. From a crash point of view, you don't have to worry about the fact of if you have an accident, the engine coming into the passenger cabin area. So that's a big assistance from a design point of view. That probably is about it, really. I think
removing the engine's a big one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you find? I'm always, I guess, a little surprised when you look at a survey of Australian new car buyers and you ask them, what are the most important things to you when you're buying a new car? Often safety's at number 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 on the consideration set. It's what does it look like? What colour is it? What does it say about me? How much does it cost? And then safety's right down the bottom. When you speak to Volvo customers, what are they looking for in terms of safety?
A lot of ours are probably have the experience already of why that's one of the reasons why they bought the car.
Right.
With the new cars coming out now, there are a new demographic of owners coming through, but it's still there. We're renowned as a safety brand, and I think that's the thing that they're looking at. They know that they're going to get a safe, reliable product, and not have to worry about. We always talk about safety, but it's something that's you don't see it.
No, that's
like
right.
no one knows you've got an airbag in the car until you've had an accident and it comes out. So it's
And it previously hasn't been cool either. And cool's sort of a catch-all word for interesting or trendy or whatever it might be. But safety's never been something to say, I'm proud that my car's really safe. It's more, I'm proud of what it looks like.
And it's probably been the classic over the years. The number of people that, I bought a safe car for my wife or my partner.
Yeah. What about what you're driving?
Or the kid. Yeah, exactly. And there is sort of that as well. So there's a sort of certain mentality that goes through that. It's.
We mentioned before that you almost wouldn't. Well, you wouldn't recommend a car if theoretically a car comes on sale tomorrow that doesn't have anti-lock brakes, right? You're not going to recommend that somebody buy that vehicle. From a Volvo perspective, and I guess the temptation's to just say everything, but if an everyday family's shopping for a new car right now while they're watching this, what's a must-have, do you think, in terms of a baseline of safety?
I think probably what you've referred back to as probably what you see in ANCAP results. You need to have A/B systems. You need to have an active cruise control is good, but at least have collision avoidance. Lane keeping assistance or notifications are handy as well. But some of this just depends on what type of driving you do. If you're on the country roads all the time, lane keeping assistance is probably more important than an AEB at low speed in the city, because that's not the sort of driving you're doing. And I think that's important for any car buyer, is that you need to look at what are you going to use this car for? What are the benefits to you? And then look at what you actually need in it.
Does Volvo have a position on what drivers can do individually to make their time on the road safer?
No, I don't think we sort of do from that point of view.
Yeah.
It's
just buy the safest car you can.
Yeah, and realistically, and that comes down to your kids as well. There was always the sort of, I'll buy the cheap car for the kids to start learning in and go off, which is probably the wrong way around. If you look at the accident rates from a learner, that first 3 to 4 months in P plates, it goes from there's nothing to up here and then back down again. So, you need them to have something in their car that's actually going to help them when they make a mistake, because they're a provisional driver, they are going to make a mistake. So that's where you don't want anything to happen then.
I would imagine, I'm not suggesting you at Volvo and us at Drive are going to overnight make safety sexy, so to speak, but you're going to find it hard to find anybody who would disagree that increased driver training, better safety technology, safer cars on the road, and putting young people, first-time drivers, in safest vehicles we can possibly afford for them. You find it hard to find anybody who wouldn't agree with that, I would have thought.
No, exactly. If you look at it, there's always been safer cars, safer roads and safer drivers has sort of basically been some of the government catch cries and things like that. The more we can teach people, it's all well and good to put technology into the cars. We also have to have, and we can do this when the cars are new, but the second owner, the people have to understand how this technology works, what it can do. If you remember when ABS first came out, everyone thought it would make you stop quicker.
Yes.
Well, it actually doesn't. All it does is it gives you control of the car whilst you're stopping, so you can change lanes or something like that. And some of this other tech is a little bit the same. People need to have an understanding of its limitations as well as its advantages.
Lastly, your large SUVs, especially in rural areas that you touched on before, you see a lot of people towing with them. Does Volvo have any just general tips on towing? Is it as simple as know how heavy the trailer is, or is it know what you're doing with it? Does Volvo have any general tips on towing?
No, I think personally from experience it is first work out what it is and how much it weighs. How much it weighs and how much it weighs whether we're talking ball load, axle load, and if you start dabbling in caravan weights or something like that, it's a whole new world of pain to actually try and work out whether it's gross vehicle mass, gross combined masses, and things like that. So I think the main thing is be aware of what you're towing, what the weight of it is, and how it sits on the car.